Howdy, ladies and gentlemen. This is Paul, the Redneck Thinker. I hope you were able to work on your goals today. I hope that you were able to move forward in your life. It's been an interesting day with us sending $95 billion to foreign countries. Now, I'm not saying that the causes of these countries aren't justified for the needing of support. Um, but some of it is interesting because of the politics behind some of this. But um, we'll have to examine that as we go forward. It's unfortunately done, but we'll have to examine that going forward. Another thing that I want to talk about is congratulations to the Louisiana State University women's gymnastics team. They're the now national champions of women's gymnastics. They dethroned Oklahoma. Uh, it's congratulations to them. Now, today I'm going to talk about a gentleman that gets very little airtime. Well, true airtime. You have people that talk about the give me liberty or give me death speech, but they don't examine the full life of Patrick Henry. Patrick Henry is somebody that I look up to. Yes, he had his faults. I'm well aware that he had his faults. Anybody with that strong of feelings about things is going to have faults. That's the nature of the beast when it comes to human beings. But Patrick Henry was far more than one speech. He stood up for individual liberty all over the nation. But he only did it from Virginia. He didn't go out onto the national stage very often, except for a short stint that he was in the Continental Congress. His love was for Virginia. Um, I mean, he was the governor of Virginia 5 times. Now, mind you, take into account the simple fact of that back then, when you were governor of Virginia, you only were governor of Virginia for 1 year. So keep that in mind when you're thinking about him being the governor of Virginia. He was governor of Virginia for 5 years of his life. He was in the House of Burgesses. He was in the state legislature when we became a state. When the House of Delegates is what it started out being called during the Revolutionary War. And he was a staunch anti-federalist. Now, some folks have used that as a way to attack him because he didn't, what was his, but George Washington, if you're thinking of George Washington, Washington stood for the Constitution. Patrick Henry didn't, because he saw that a strong centralized government could lead to all kinds of abuses. Hey, he was kind of right if you think about it. But the first thing that he really stood for, the first thing that he became known for, was the Parsons cause. Only he wasn't standing for the Parsons, he was standing for the people. Now, to understand the environment of Virginia, because this was a state issue that had national implications, actually much further than just the colonies of the time. The Church of England had the power to tax. It was called tithes. If you go through that, the tithes records are some of the best ways to track your family and to track who was who back in that time. Now, yes, we're going to have issues with the many different religions. That was the Quaker Church, which outside of Pennsylvania did not have a lot of voice. But the Quaker Church was spreading. Most people are not aware that in Virginia, the Quaker Church had tried to have a foothold here. And that foothold was tenuous at best. Why? Because the local powers that be tried to stamp it out. The same was said of the Baptist. The same was said of the Presbyterians. Those were the three major religions that tried to come in here outside of the Church of England. Well, the Church of England, especially the vestrymen, I'm not real up to date on Anglican, Church of England, Anglican, same church. I'm not real up to date about each one of these positions. But the vestrymen were important within the Church of England, and these were important people within the community itself. So, these folks were able to shape how everybody looked at everything, both on a social and political level, and on a business level, in a lot of ways. But the Church of England, no matter what religion you were in the state of Virginia, whether you were Quaker, whether you were Baptist, whether you were Presbyterian, you had to pay taxes, or tithes, as it was called, to the Anglican Church. You also had to attend Anglican, by law, you had to attend Anglican church services. And the vestrymen, who were the important people, they showed up in dramatic fashion and walked into the church together. I mean, it was a whole big, it was a big public thing back then. Thankfully, we don't have that today, but that was the way of things back before the Revolutionary War. Well, there was a drought that occurred. This was in the 1750s and 1760s, and a young lawyer who was the son of a judge got tapped by the farmers that were being told, hey, you have to pay this, even though it was going to ruin them. They got told, hey, you do this. This is the law, and you're going to have to do this. So, they asked around to try to find a lawyer, and they found the only one that they could get was a young lawyer by the name of Patrick Henry. So, he set up the trial, or set it up so that they would be able to go to trial. And lo and behold, the person who was the judge of this trial was his own father. His father was an important man. Now, Patrick Henry was educated at home. Patrick Henry did have pretty good learning. I mean, his father was a judge, and he also got to learn from another prominent lawyer. But he was young, fiery, but he was young. Because Patrick Henry was born okay, looking up the date here, the exact day he was born. He was born May 29th, 1736. So, he was still in his 20s. He was untested as a lawyer. He was a young lawyer in a lot of ways. He had done little minor things, but he had not really done this level of trial. And he's doing this before his father, which he had to have some nervousness to him. But he got up there. He got up there and he decided he was going to defend these people. And he did, but he wasn't successful. But it wasn't just because he wasn't successful specifically in that trial. He was successful in turning people's opinions. He tried other cases along the same lines. And Patrick Henry was seen as a leader. Now, we're not talking leadership in the way that we have today. We have a whole bunch of people flapping their jaws, but they're not really doing a whole lot. And you've got some folks that are trying to do stuff, that are honestly out there fighting. We're not talking fighting in the sense of keeping their jobs. We're talking for individual freedom. But those folks are far and few between. The Republican Party, the Democrat Party, both think that they need to take people's rights away so that they have more power. You've got government bureaucrats that are standing in the way of us having our individual rights because it takes away from their power. That's what Patrick Henry foresaw happening, and that's what he fought for. We don't have a lot of people doing that nowadays. We have a few folks, sure, but you take a look at, okay, so 1763, let me set this up. You've got folks who, when a drought happens, they're still having to pay their debts because the debts are based around tobacco. Colony of Virginia at the time. Everything was based on tobacco. That's what this was founded on. And the ministers of the Church of England were paid their salaries in tobacco, which meant that a tobacco shortage caused people to have to scrimp even more to be able to pay these ministers. By law, this had to happen. The ministers were living pretty good off the people of Virginia. And this was a legal thing. Because of this, the Virginia legislature passed, I'm reading this from the history.com, passed Two Penny Act, which set the value of Anglican ministers' annual salaries at 2 pennies per pound of tobacco, rather than the inflated price, which was going on because of everything, which was closer to 6 pennies per pound. Anglican clergy appealed to Britain's King George III, who overturned the law and encouraged ministers to sue for back pay. Patrick Henry, that first time, went into the courtroom. He was facing a really decent lawyer. His dad was the judge, and his dad, while trying to be fair and impartial, was still for the rule of law. So he understood what his son was fighting. So he knew that this would be if he failed at it, it could ruin his career. If he succeeded, it could actually ruin his career. That his young son was walking a tightrope at such an early stage of his career. Henry even did a bit of drama. Patrick Henry even did a bit of drama. He stood there or he sat there when it was his turn to start giving his speech. He sat there in silence for a few minutes. Like, it caused his dad to worry, caused the folks that he was defending to worry. Because he sat there for a couple of minutes in silence. And then he stood up. And he delivered a speech. And that speech was on British overreach into colonial affairs, arguing that a king, by annulling or disallowing acts of so salutatory of nature, from being father of his people, degenerated into a tyrant, and forfeits all rights to his subjects' obedience. This was the speech he gave. Now, the trial went against Henry, but he changed public opinion that day. Now, there were two things at play here. There were, via the Bill of Rights, there were two things at play here. And most people don't talk about that today. Why? Because everybody focuses on the freedom of religion angle. First Amendment states, Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof. It also goes on, freedom of speech, press, assembly, and to petition the government. But no law respecting an establishment of religion. Congress, first word of the First Amendment, Congress. It doesn't say that state legislatures, it doesn't say that local authorities can't do this. Even with the passing of the 14th Amendment, which allows the federal government more power into local matters. When they wrote the First Amendment, it wasn't to control the states. States were seen as having more power. Local power was also a thought back then. So Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof. Think about that for a minute. It wasn't saying, and the people that passed that law, or that amendment, pardon me, the people that passed that are people who, quite a few of them, had to be Christian. There were Jews in America. Okay, they weren't looked at necessarily as the creme de la creme of what they wanted in this country. But They were here. People knew about them. People knew about Islam. They may not have understood it in any way, shape, or form. Thomas Jefferson, they keep talking about, oh, Thomas Jefferson owned a Quran. He did it because the Muslims of North Africa were the enemy of the United States. He was trying to understand his enemy. So, them talking about that, um, that is not something he was trying to defend. But that was the that was created, and people knew it because back then it was the denominations that were more thought of. But it wasn't that it couldn't defend or didn't defend non-Christian languages or languages, non-Christian rights. Pardon me. But here's the other thing that people don't think about when they hear about this. Jury nullification was not allowed. These laws that were passed, people, that the writers of the Constitution knew that the jury could have the power to honestly do things with this that may not have been popular, but it was right. So they codified jury nullification. Now, there are some states you're not allowed to mention that. If you're a defendant, if you're the lawyer for a defendant, when you're speaking, you are not allowed to bring up that the jury can say, no, this is not a valid law. The defendant may have broken the law, but it doesn't mean that the law itself was fair or even a good thing. That is what jury nullification is. It is legal in the United States. You can be serving on a jury, not appreciate the law that this person is being accused of breaking, and go, yeah, no, I'm not going to vote. I'm not going to vote for their guilt because this law is not right. They couldn't do that then because, well, you'd be going against the king. So, two important points that came out of this trial, because you know that it had to have been going through people's heads. Why can't we fight this law? Henry's speech on that day and the trials after that he fought to defend these farmers, all of these trials, these men that stood in the jury, those that were impassioned by what he said, they knew that they couldn't stand against it. That is why it was codified into law when we started this country. And that was the first time that he had a chance to stand in front of everybody. Now, okay. When he went to after the evidence was presented, proving the facts at issue, Maury's counsel, the reverend that was the plaintiff in this, was Reverend James Maury. Maury's counsel gave a speech in praise of the clergy, many of whom were in attendance. Henry responded with a 1-hour speech ignoring the question of damages, but which focused on the unconstitutionality of the veto of the Two-Penny Act by the King's government. Henry deemed any king who annulled good laws, such as the Two-Penny Act, as a tyrant who forfeits all rights subjects' obedience, and the clergy, by challenging an impartial law designed to bring economic relief, had shown themselves to be enemies of the community. The opposing council accused Henry of treason, and some took up that cry, but Henry continued, and the judge did nothing to stop him. Mind you, this was Patrick Henry's father who was the judge. Henry urged the jury to make an example of Maury for the benefit of any who might seek to imitate him, and suggest that the jury return damages of 1 farthing. Farthing, British coin worth a quarter of an old penny. Jury was out for only moments and fixed damages at 1 penny. So yes, he lost, but he won the war, but he lost the battle. Henry was hailed as a hero. According to biographer Henry Mayer, Henry had defined the prerogatives of the local elite by the unorthodox means of mobilizing the emotions of the lower ranks of religious and political outsiders. Henry's popularity greatly increased. Added 164 new clients that year. Now, mind you, take into the fact that Henry was failed at business. He was a good man, really good lawyer, but he wasn't that good at business. So for him to get that was a very good thing. Here was this thing that blew him up in popularity, and this is 1763. So he was still in his 30s when the Revolutionary War started. But right after this, 1764, 1765, Henry gained a strong following. Now, this was considered the boonies of Virginia, but everybody got to talking about this because back then, newspapers actually covered the news. And so this was one of the things that it was talked about. He was able to go to the House of Burgesses. Not as a member right away, but he went there and he got to talking to the members of the Committee of Privileges and Elections. So this introduced him to Richard Henry Lee, Peyton Randolph, and George Wythe. George Wythe is another founding father that I will probably talk about later on. Richard Henry Lee, part of the Lee family. Most everybody only thinks about Robert E. Lee, Civil War general. Most people only think about him. They don't think about the others of that family. That family was a very powerful family at the beginning of the nation. Peyton Randolph was a planner, politician, one of the more wealthy people. He was president of the first 2 Virginia conventions. Important man. He sat. Then, by May 1765, he won a seat to the House of Burgesses. Now, this was a time that the English government was trying to recoup the money that they had spent on what was outside of the United States. It was called the 7 Years' War. Inside the United States, it was called the French and Indian War. The French and Indian War part of it is what started the 7 Years' War. It was the French and the English had different ideas as to where the borders between their colonies were here in the New World. George Washington was actually the on the English side. was was the leader of the first group that came into conflict with the French. And this led to the French and Indian War. George Washington became a big military hero during this time. Stamp Act was passed after everything was done with the fighting. People didn't think a lot of it, but Patrick Henry came in, and it was also around the same time that the Stamp Act was passed in the British Parliament. Henry, being Henry, introduced the Virginia Stamp Act resolves. It said, first and foremost, that those of the colonies, specifically the Virginians, but the colonists, had the same rights and privileges as somebody who lived in Great Britain, aka the islands themselves. And it said that taxation should be exacted only by the representatives. Taxation without representation. This became a big deal. This became a really big deal because you're talking, this is 1765. You've got 10 years. 10 years before there is a major push that became the Revolutionary War. It wasn't that the people of America didn't see themselves as British. Matter of fact, they did see themselves as British. But this is pushing the people further away from Great Britain. They are looking at how Great Britain is treating them. They're seeing that their voice is not being heard by the Parliament. Now, at that time, they are seeing the Parliament as the problem. They are not seeing the king as the problem. They thought that the king was still someone that they could redress their concerns to. At that time, we're talking 1765 time frame. But Parliament was introducing taxation while hurting trade. The Parliament was only allowing trade. The colonies were only allowed to trade between Britain and themselves. They were not allowed to trade with the Spanish. They weren't allowed to trade with the Dutch. They were only allowed those things which came from Great Britain. At the same time, as I've talked about, the people that did business with the colonists the way that they were doing these things was actually causing the colonists to go further and further into debt. Well, the Stamp Act was the most painful of the taxes that were introduced. So you're having to pay the local ministers. You're having to pay the local Anglican ministers, Church of England ministers. You're having to pay for any paper goods that had to have a stamp on it. Now, everybody nowadays goes, well, it was only this percentage. Yes, but all the different taxes were adding up. Now, some folks didn't see it quite like that, but most folks did. So, they fought it. And the Virginia Stamp Act resolves were actually pretty much the first ones that were passed in the colonies. AKA, Henry was showing himself again to be a leader. As Henry said, if this be treason, make the most of it. It was done in a way that it fought off the Stamp Act, but it caused, at the same time, the Parliament to have ill will towards the colonies. We can't bring them into our power. That was their thinking. Even though the colonies thought of themselves as British citizens who weren't being represented. So this was the voice, their voice in a lot of ways, was coming from a man from Virginia. Not somebody who necessarily had a large public stage or a large national stage, because there was no national stage. Benjamin Franklin had attempted to get this via the Albany Plan. That's what it was called. To get the colonies to work together, but the British government didn't want that, so they fought that, and it didn't happen. A lot of the colonies didn't want to work with the other colonies, because the colonies, up until the Civil War, even though we had a United States, even though we had what was called the United States, the states, and before that the colonies, were seen as separate powers. Because of the Civil War and because of all that went on then, we became more than just separate states. But up until that point, people didn't see the United States as their home. They saw their state as their home. Think about that mentality when you take a look at the Civil War. I'm not defending the South. I am telling you facts. So, Virginia fought against the Stamp Act. And that movement went throughout the colonies. And that fought. Now, Henry, at that time, was starting to see some success, so he bought some property. He was, well, let's just say, he was like all the other people of the time, had several kids. He was prolific in producing kids. So he had to have land. And he became more important. He was on the lower rungs of being gentry. That was the aristocrats of the time period. Where George Washington, because of birth and because of land, and because of his business acumen, was at the top rungs of the gentry. And Henry himself was growing his level of power to be considered. He started out on lower rungs, but by the time of the Revolutionary War, he had risen to near the top. Now, Henry saw what was happening. He saw that the only way that things could be done was to rally people. You had Common Sense, the pamphlet Common Sense, that rallied the people. Samuel Adams, President John Adams, well, soon to be President John Adams' cousin, was rallying people up in Massachusetts. And then you had a little known feller that was, well, okay, I say little known. He was well known. I'll backtrack on that. I made a mistake. He gets up. The House of Burgesses the royal governor had said the House of Burgesses could no longer meet. So the folks that were part of the House of Burgesses went to Richmond. They went from Williamsburg and they went to Richmond. And they held a meeting. It was called the Second Virginia Convention. And it was at St. James Episcopal Church. they thought that it was a better place to meet since there was less of the royal folks there. And everybody's giving speeches, but Patrick Henry stands up. And at the end of the speech, it is, if we were base enough to desire it, it is now too late to retire from the contest. There is no retreat, but in submission and slavery, our chains are forged. Their clanking may be heard on the plains of Boston. The war is inevitable, and let it come. I repeat it, sir, let it come. It is in vain, sir, to extenuate the matter. Gentlemen may cry, peace, peace, there is no peace. The war has actually begun. The next gale that sweeps from the north will bring to our ears the clash of resounding arms. Our brethren are already in the field. Why stand we here idle? What is it that gentlemen wish? What would they have? Is life so dear, or peace so sweet, as to be purchased at the price of chains and slavery? Forbid it, Almighty God. I know not what course others may take, but as for me, give me liberty or give me death. That speech was reprinted and sent all over the colonies. Probably went back to England and annoyed a few folks there. That's considered one of the three things that truly sparked what really became the Revolutionary War. What had been something limited up north as well, it grew to all the colonies. Well, not all the colonies, not Canada, but what became the United States. Now, Henry only one time had any military ties. And after this speech, he was elected to go to the Second Continental Congress. But he was told before then, hey, there's a problem because Lord Dunsmore, the governor of the royally appointed governor of the state of Virginia, was wanting to seize gunpowder from the magazine in Williamsburg. Henry found out about it. He took command of the local militia. This is the only time that he did anything really military. And he went to Williamsburg. This is after Lexington and Concord. Now, all that he was able to get done by this was get the governor's council to pay the value of the powder. That was the best he could do. But there was a proclamation that was against a certain Patrick Henry of the county of Hanover and a number of his deluded followers. Now, most of the counties approved of this, but this is what happened. But Henry got to the Second Continental Congress May 18th. He was late. He only played a supporting role, but that was from Jefferson. He was commissioned as a colonel in the 1st Virginia Regiment. He didn't really get a chance to do anything with that. But he recruited men. He also organized a navy. Dunsmore no longer had Williamsburg, but he was elected governor. Henry was elected governor of the state of Virginia. Because by that time they were like, hey, we're a state. They had done the House of Delegates. They had created the House of Delegates. Now, the first governor, the first time he was governor, he had to work. He had to work among different people. We had the dissenters here in Virginia, what was known as the dissenters. I'm reading a good book. Um, I think it downplays certain aspects, but they were called the dissenters. It was Presbyterians and the Baptists. These folks, the folks that were in charge of the war, had been Anglican vestrymen. They had done things against those people who were not Anglican. They had used the church as a weapon against these folks. But they now needed those folks, the Presbyterians and the Baptists. So, as governor, Henry had to work with these folks. And he did throughout the war. Freedom of religion. War's over. Okay, he made one misstep in my opinion. He supported a Virginia law, not a national law, but a Virginia law that would have seen the taxation brought back, but it was shot down thanks to James Madison. But during that time when they were talking about we needed a strong federal government, I'm not in complete disagreement that we needed a strong federal government, but the North, well, certain interests were put into it that the Anti-Federalists saw as a bad thing. And that was where Henry got to be the last time leader in this country. Even though he wasn't at the Constitutional Convention, even though that he'd never, except for once, had a national stage, he was a leader within the Anti-Federalist movement. Okay, this put him at a disagreement with Washington. I've read another book that I couldn't get through because the guy's conclusions and history were skewed. Washington had to rely on the political acumen of Patrick Henry. And Patrick Henry, though he didn't always get everything that he wanted to the Continental Army, he did a better job than most. He fought and fought with everybody. He worked compromises. He worked to make sure that the Continental Army could have the best that it could have from the state of Virginia. So Henry and Washington knew each other. They respected each other. But didn't mean they always agreed. The Constitution would not have been possible if it wasn't for George Washington. Yes, James Madison wrote it. Yes, Benjamin Franklin also was a strong proponent. He had his Albany plan. But Henry was not going to be, he wasn't going to stand down just because the eminent George Washington was for it. Because of the Anti-Federalists, because of the power that they exerted, and because of the writings of Patrick Henry and others, but Patrick Henry was one of the leaders of the Anti-Federalist movement, we got our Bill of Rights. Henry was still a firebrand. But let me tell you something. It didn't cause George Washington to hate or dislike Henry to the point that he didn't still respect Henry. How we know this is that George Washington goes to Prince Edward County, where Henry had his plantation, and he tried to talk Henry into becoming a member of his cabinet. Henry declined, but it was because he had spent so much time in the limelight that he needed to get matters right for his family. And so he did. He actually stepped away from the limelight in the latter years so that he could make sure that his family was taken care of. Yes, people asked his opinion. Yes, he gave his opinion. Yes, he did a few things that in the courtroom, but he wasn't ever. He had stepped away from the limelight, and he didn't need to be in the limelight. He had fought and got the Bill of Rights. He had done so much for this country, all from the state of Virginia. So, this is the power of somebody using their intellect, of being a leader in different ways, because he was a leader via the courtroom. He was a leader via the House of Burgesses, the House of Delegates, as a governor, but not on the national stage. But he was on the national stage because what he did here in Virginia was passed on everywhere. We don't really have those things anymore in this country. We have a few folks that are fighting for freedom, but they're getting shouted down. Freedom is what we need in this country. This is what this country was founded on. And we need that here. And Patrick Henry was willing to stand up for freedom. Are you ready to stand up for freedom? Seriously. Think about that for a minute. Are you standing up for freedom, or are you standing up for political ideology? Are you standing up for the Republican Party, or are you standing up for freedom? That is what you have to consider. What are you standing up for? Okay, ladies and gentlemen, I'm going to let you go. If you like this on YouTube, Rumble, hit a like, comment, subscribe. Podbean, follow. I'm going to post this to Facebook, Twitter, MeWe, Reddit, and LinkedIn. If you're seeing me from there, hey, say hi. I have a page on Facebook called The Ramblings of Paul Shannon. The Writings of a Redneck Thinker on MeWe. I'm Redneck Thinker on MeWe, Twitter, YouTube, Rumble, Reddit. I go by my name on Facebook. LinkedIn, I go by my name. I have the Freedom VN, stands for Visual Novel, Freedom VN, where I have a book. You can get it for free. It asks for a donation. If you want to just download it, fine. If you want to donate, I will be much appreciated. I also have a Patreon, Freedom VN. So, this is Paul, the Redneck Thinker. Have a good day.